I'm going to try something new and hold the mic. So if it's a disaster, let's just blame it on that. Two things you should know about me before we start. One is I am totally a socks after underwear guy. Before the pants, I think it's by far the best method of getting changed. Second thing, if Casey is the guy who thinks he got an accidental invitation to teach, I think I got a purposeful invitation, but I think I stuck around and they're waiting for me to fall back and rescind my invitation. A great quote that I've been thinking about this week as I've been getting ready to teach is from a really wise man who said, "In learning you will teach, and in teaching you will learn." Does anyone know where that came from? Phil Collins, yes, from Tarzan, the Tarzan soundtrack. It's a great soundtrack. I love listening to that one. It has some great truth in it, just like that one. Jacob, yeah, okay. And I think it's true for me. I think I learned a lot in getting ready to teach and preparing to teach. There's a lot of value for me, so thank you for the opportunity to teach here. But if you haven't been with us before or haven't been with us lately, we've been going through the book of Genesis. We've just arrived at chapter 30, and so far what we've seen has kind of been a disaster at times. If you've been with us, you know we've had some high highs and we've had some low lows, but we can all breathe a sigh of relief today, right? Get to chapter 30. If you read it, you know there's a shining example of great choices, pure hearts, right? No, it's wrong. The chaos continues here. I just want to name some of the things included in this chapter. Jealousy, threats, sex for hire, deception, what seems to be a human breeding competition, and polygamy. But while we look at this chapter today, I want to try and convince you of something, and that's 1 + 1 = 3. Really, what I want to do is show you that in God's economy, things don't work the same way the world expects them to. The world would tell us that you're in charge of your fate. You work to accomplish that, and if you work hard enough, you'll get it. Or vice versa. You have a goal in mind, you fail to prepare or fail to work for that goal, and it's over. 1 + 1 = 2. It doesn't work out quite the same way here, though, as we know from reading through Genesis. When we do the math on the story of Genesis and on this chapter, we can see that when we add it up, there's 1, which is God's ideal way of living, plus 1, which is our failure to live up to that ideal, equals 3, which is the successful carrying out of God's plan. It does not result in failure. So to begin this teaching, I just want to lay out some of God's principles for life that will be relevant as we embark on this mathematical experiment, I guess you call it. These are ideals which have been put forth in God's Word, which we can read today. Some of them kind of explicitly before this chapter of Genesis, some of them after. So the first one is marriage to one spouse. Genesis chapter 2 holds the key to this one, which Will talked about last week, and which has to be one of the most quoted verses at wedding ceremonies, which says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." A man and his wife are the operative words here. A man and a woman shall be married to each other and each other alone, because that is the only way faithfulness can be achieved. And some examples, even before this chapter, of marriages to more than one wife, in a snapshot of their situation lies in chapter 4. Lamech is speaking to both his wives when he asserts his violence, claiming that his revenge will be 10 times that of the Bible's first murderer, Cain. In chapter 16, Abraham takes Hagar as a wife after he listened to the voice of Sarah and creates centuries of messiness and bitterness with his descendants. It's an echo of what we read 13 chapters earlier in the fall, that Adam listened to Eve. We see Esau, just a couple chapters ago, married 2 women and then added a third by marrying an Ishmaelite woman. He did this in response to hearing his father say that it would be good to marry an Ishmaelite woman. So he's essentially treating the woman as leverage in his relationship with his father. So that's marriage. The next one would be children. And I don't mean having children. I mean the way that we view children. Psalm 127 says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them." Even if you take what we've read and been taught on so far, God's promises often include what? They often include descendants, which are children. His promises and his blessings often come by way of multiplying his people, meaning he will provide them children. Thus, we see that children are a blessing. Children are a joy. Children are often part of God's plans here in Genesis. What we don't see is that children are a tool. Children should be pawns used to accomplish some purpose of yours, or to prove yourself, or to acquire something for yourself. The next one is honesty and integrity. And kind of simply put, I like to think of honesty as telling the truth and integrity as living the truth. You might have a different definition than that, but what it boils down to in either case is truthfulness. And God has a lot to say about honesty and truthfulness. Here's just a couple snippets. Proverbs 12:22 says, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. Then we have Proverbs 19:1, which says, better is a poor person who walks in his integrity than one who is crooked in speech and is a fool. So we see God values truth. It's his will that we would be truthful, and it's out of God's own character to be dishonest. And not out of his character, meaning it's unusual for him to do that or to be dishonest. Like, he's usually a nice guy, and every once in a while he messes up. But rather, if God is who he says he is, he can't lie. Perfection cannot include dishonesty. And the last ideal, which I won't go into too much detail on, is just submission to God's will. Having a will, that God has a will, and that we aren't submitting to that will. So now we're going to move on. That was the first one in the formula. Now we'll move on to the second one in the formula, which we'll explore sort of just by telling the story as it is here in the chapter. We've walked through some ugly stories so far with kind of most mistakes in the book, right? We've seen people do what they aren't supposed to do, people not do what they're supposed to do, people listening and not doing what they hear, people not listening, people running away, people lying. Kind of starts to sound like, recess or like trying to raise children, right? So I'm going to go ahead and read. If you're comfortably able, would you stand with me as I read from Genesis chapter 30, verses 1 through 13 here. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Then she said, here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, good fortune has come, so she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy, so she called his name Asher. Thanks for standing. You can sit now. So where are we now? We land in the middle of chapter 30 with a man named Jacob, and whether he understood it or not, and despite the circumstances, he's married 2 women. I think there's some wonderful irony in this. The man whose name means he cheats is cheated into marrying the less desirable of 2 sisters and then marrying the other as well. Also, it's so funny. My brother's name is Jacob, and he's here, and I keep saying it and keep talking about how he's a cheater, so I'm sorry, Jacob. I'm sorry you're here today. And the details of this love or marriage triangle for Jacob and Rachel and Leah don't make it any better. They kind of set this up to be a complete train wreck. Because on one side, you have the unloved wife, the neglected wife, the one less preferred is what they say, with 4 wonderful sons, and now with the hope that her husband will come to love her as she is expecting. Fertility in this time and place was honorable and held in high esteem, and she had it. And she also had precedence in the relationship. Jacob did marry her first, which meant something. But you can feel her desperation and see where her hope lies as we look at the names of her children. First is Reuben, which means, look, a son. She's trying to call attention to him, reaching out to Jacob. Second, Simeon, the Lord has heard. The Lord has heard that I am hated, and perhaps my husband will too. Third, Levi is attachment. Now this time, my husband will be attached to me, which you can see she's not even asking for love this time. And then lastly, Judah, which means praise. This time, I will praise the Lord. She makes no further plea to her husband for love or even affection, but praises God instead. So we can kind of see where she is at the time. And on the other side, you have the preferred wife, the crown jewel of Jacob, his favorite. Quite literally, as we learn later in the chapter, the one he lives with, the one he sleeps with at night. But she's barren. She's unable to have children. She's actually so desperate to have children that, as Will mentioned last week, I didn't get to see the video because it wasn't up, but I think, she states, "Give me children or I shall die," which some have interpreted as a tragic suggestion that she might harm herself if she does not have children. And we aren't far from the story of Hagar, are we? Rachel would be familiar with this story. And even with that, here she is standing face to face with a man who worked 7 years to earn the right to marry her, worked another 7 more when it ended up being her sister instead. And in the face of that, she doesn't cease to say, there's still something more that I need to be satisfied. There's still something more I need to be valued. She throws that love from Jacob aside and goes into this battle of the births by way of her servant, Bilhah. And then voila, she appears to get what she wants. She has 2 children, 2 sons at that. And then we could see through her names and her children how personal this battle of the children has become. First, there's Dan, which means judged. Rachel is announcing that this child is evidence of God's favorable judgment on her life. Second, there's Naphtali, with wrestlings of God is what this means. She's essentially saying that God has judged her, but she has risen through the struggle, and check it out, Leah. I have 2 sons. The competition is on. So if God's will and his way for our view of children are for them to be a blessing, a joy, a delight, and a reward, then what do we have here? We see some complete and utter failures in Rachel and Leah. They're holding their children against each other, holding their children against their husband, against God, and are kind of using them as pawns in this horizontal battle they are waging against themselves. So as a lot of points in the Bible, you wonder, could it get worse? What is going to happen next? I'm just going to read a couple of verses as these papers just fall over. My problem was I did some notes last night, so things are a little scattered up here, but I think we're getting through it okay. So this is going to be verses 14 through 16 here. It says, "In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, 'Please give me some of your son's mandrakes.' But she said to her, 'Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?' Rachel said, 'Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes.' When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, 'You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes.' So he lay with her that night." So Reuben, the son of Leah, is about 9 or 10 years old and is out in the fields. He stumbles upon these plants called mandrakes. I don't know if there's kind of some mystery about what they are, but they think this is what they look like. But if you're like me, all you can think of is Harry Potter, right? And I was making myself a heathen standing up here talking about Harry Potter, but all I can think about is those shrieking plants from Harry Potter. But these are something a little bit different. These are plants that have large, wrinkled leaves, small purple flowers, with roots that they said could grow up to several feet long and several pounds heavy. That's sexy, right? That's what you guys thought of when I described that? Wrinkled leaves and big roots. They scream aphrodisiac, don't they? Well, I didn't think so, but in ancient times, yes. The correlation was clear. Another name for this plant would have been love apples. And in reality, the power of the mandrakes as an aphrodisiac, as a fertility drug, were mythical. But it was obvious that Rachel and Leah both believed in it. as it becomes part of this negotiation between them. And yet again, we have the childless wife suggesting the expedient solution. First, pregnancy through her servants, and now the aphrodisiac. And R.C. Sproul, when he talks about this chapter, he describes it this way. He says that Rachel desires this solution so much that she leans in and begins trading things that ought to be above trading, and the family ethics become those of breeding dogs. Jacob and his seed become a commodity that's being passed back and forth, with both wives vying for something in it. Rachel wants what she does not have, which is children of her own. And Leah wants what she does not have, which is her husband's time, his affection, and his attention. And of all things, there's one thing that's absent from this deal, which I think is really important, and that's Jacob. Jacob is not present when these negotiations are happening. So he's absent for the deal, but then he finishes his day of work, becomes present, shows up from being in the field, and gets told, hey, you've been hired for the night. Go ahead and walk on over to Leah's tent. And similar to what Casey talked about with Abraham kind of sitting on his hands and letting himself be ordered around, he doesn't question it, and he follows through. He walks over, basically is prostituted out to his own wife, and sleeps with her. So we can feel the effects of this two-spouse marriage pretty immediately here, right? We can see some of the problems that it's causing. We can see the lack of honesty and integrity coming up as well. So where does that put us in our math problem? We have 1, which was God's will and way, plus 1, our utter failure, their utter failure to live up to that plan. And that should land us at 2. That should land us at a point of misery, to a point of failure of any plans at all, to a point where we say, nothing good has come. This blew up in my face. Now I look like a fool. But it doesn't. When we look at the complete arc of the story that has continued on in this chapter here, we see that 1 plus 1 really does equal 3, because there's someone else anchoring the ship. There's someone else overseeing it all. I think this kind of might be my favorite part of the chapter here, which was a hard chapter. I don't know if you guys read it and thought, this is clear and easy on what to teach on, but I did not. But my favorite part here is what comes of the mandrake exchange. We see who the wife who gives up the mandrakes, who gives up the mythical tool for becoming pregnant, becomes the wife that gets pregnant. The superstition of the mandrakes immediately becomes null and void, because the one who gave them up is the one reaping the rewards they were thought to bring. This is because of what's written in verse 17, which says, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. And Rachel, in turn, doesn't conceive in the 3 years and successive pregnancies that followed for Leah. Then Rachel is desperate, and God answers. Verse 22 says, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son. The difference with this child and this mother is that there are no mandrakes. There are no surrogates. There's no forcing of the hand. What's left is God and the work he's doing. God has heard Rachel. God has opened her womb, and God has caused her to conceive. And the words used to describe Rachel conceiving are the same exact words that are used to describe Leah conceiving. The emphasis in them is that it is God alone and grace alone who is providing these children amid the mess, amidst the dealing of a husband like a stud horse, of the superstitious fertility drugs and competing wives. God is at work. The ladder that Jacob dreamt of in chapter 28, and of which we're memorizing that promise, right? It's intact. That promise is intact, and it's actually moving forward. God has no trouble working through these unlikely circumstances and these unlikely events or discouraging events in this chapter to accomplish his will. And Rachel finishes by naming her son Joseph, or may the Lord add to me another son. And we can see again where she is, because later he does provide another son, and she is still not satisfied. But who is Joseph? Who are all of these children? I have a slide up there showing kind of the genealogy of Christ. So despite all of the messiness going on here, we have the origins of Christ and the origins of Israel. I think you don't have to have spent a long time or a lot of time in church to understand or be vaguely familiar with the term tribes of Israel. Well, in this chapter, here they are being born. In all their glory, there's one father, there's 4 mothers, there's names based on their mother's feelings and desires. There's a cheating father, a cheating grandfather. And they're not even in the land of Israel yet. But here they are, the leaders of the tribes of Israel. And here we see the line of Christ being born. In the mess, God is working for his own purposes. Also, I apologize. I'm looking at that now. That is tiny. What you need to know is those are just the generations until Christ at the bottom there. But we see that throughout the chapter, the tribe of Israel is being formed. God is opening and closing wombs. He's listening to the prayers of these women. Later, he's making Jacob prosperous through the breeding of sheep. And I think it's an important recognition that we're not just seeing humans interacting with humans. We're seeing a God who is setting the stage for an epic story. He's doing his specific work despite the sin and chaos going on in this family. So I kind of want to make 2 encouragements here for people in different situations. First, to those of us with families we're currently working to raise up. I know there's kind of a lot of us at Firm Family, right? When we bring all the kids together, it gets a little crowded, but you have a chance to write a different story with your own family. It doesn't have to be this sort of story. You have the space moving forward to love well, to love singularly, and not seek satisfaction elsewhere. To pour into your family and create a sense of love and security and value in your family members. So let's do everything we can to make that happen. On the other side, there might be people who are coming out of a messy family situation. And I think for you guys, let's take heart in what we're seeing in this chapter, that God works from tough circumstances. It's not our mistakes or the mistakes of others that have affected us that are the sovereign rulers of our lives. God is, and he will continue to make much of what might seem like nothing good. Let's not be hopeless about what has been done or what has passed up until now. So for applications, I love to ask questions. Again, I'm sorry if that's hard to see. It's so much different on the computer. But I just want to ask some questions, and I want you guys to be able to reflect on these. And then after these questions, I'll end with a closing statement there. With some questions we can think about as we read this chapter and as we come out of this time. In what ways are we comparing horizontally when we should be resting vertically? In what ways are we making for our lives plans from what we see going on in others' lives? In what ways are we dissatisfied because we think someone else has what we ought to have? What do we think would make us satisfied? For Rachel, it was children, but for us, what is it that we say, if this, then I will be satisfied. If this, God will prove his love for me. If this, I will be content. Another question is just a good reflective question of what kind of legacy has been left for us? In what ways are we affected by the generations before us or the people around us? And then from there, what kind of legacy are we working to leave? What kind of ways are we impacting generations below us, children or friends' children, or the people around us? And what kind of legacy are we leaving in that? And then just in closing, I recently attended a work training that was focused on this idea of connection, on really relating to someone to make them feel loved. And there were a couple questions that the speaker brought up that people ask in their brains when talking with someone that help them form this idea of, are we connecting? Those questions are, do you care about me? Can you help me? And can I trust you? I think these same questions are important for all of us today, believers or not, when thinking about our lives. We should consider these questions when we think of who is anchoring the ship of our lives. when we consider that person, God or ourself or something else, how would we answer those questions? Do they care about us? Can they help us? Can we trust them? If God is at the end of those questions, let's continue reading the Bible and make those answers an even more resounding yes, or just a yes at all. And if God is not the object of those questions for you and you're answering no, I pray you'd take the time to consider who really should be the ruler of your life, who should be anchoring that ship. The God who I believe to be at the center can be described like this, as quoted from Paul David Tripp. There's someone at the center of all things. There's someone who rules over heaven and earth. There's someone who defines what pure love, power, wisdom, faithfulness, righteousness, and grace look like. There's someone who controls the forces of physical nature and administrates the events of human history. There's someone who authors the plot details of the story of every human being who has lived. There is someone who is worthy of honor, dominion, and power. There's someone who's deserving of the complete allegiance and unending worship of everyone. There's someone at the center, and that is not us. We'll pray to close us. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for the work that you're doing. We thank you so much for your word that we could study here, for the ways that we could see that we are imperfect people working for a perfect God. I pray that we'd understand that we'd be encouraged by that we see the ways that you're working and work to leave a legacy of God-centeredness, of God's glory, and just allow you to work in our lives. Praise things in your heavenly name. Amen.